So in paganism, they would have different deities or different gods that they would offer sacrifices to for different reasons. So when we go and look, as I talked about before, with the Korax festival in ancient Kemet, that whole ceremony, the whole celebration was about welcoming in the new harvest. You had it from December 10th to January 8th, and during this time, you had the receding of the waters. You had new crops, basically having room to grow, and it was a celebration of something that was dealing with nature. And then we go and look at the same thing with the with voodoo. In voodoo, remember, you have different gods. It was different Loa, and it would basically summon different Loa that had different abilities. So Papa Legba, and you had Baron Samide, and a bunch of different Loa that would be, conjured to basically help with something specific. It was the same thing in paganism, and when you look at it, you see these names just basically changed, and the deities changed, but they all had different aspects or different things that they were supposed to do. And when you start looking at the Egyptian gods, if you talked about Osiris and the Spawn, you look at Ma'at dealing with justice and everything like that. You look at Isis with the moon, so on and so forth. And then you look at Hathor. You look at Kepler having to do with the sun and reincarnation or rebirth, and so on and so forth. So you had so many different deities having different things. And when you start getting into even the Egyptian gods, there's different gods that deal with different stuff that we would look at as far as on helping our body or helping something dealing with nature. So in paganism, it was the same. And you look at a lot of the older depictions, you see the pictures with them offering sacrifices to different pagan gods for different things, and so on and so forth. So in paganism, it always has been this, affinity of pleasing the gods. And it's something when you go back and start looking at old ancient, mythologies and stories, it was always about sacrifices to the gods and pleasing the gods. And it made it as if it was this, this god there, this monster type god that would come down and punish or would actually grant wishes or do something special for the people that's sacrificing, when that's basically taken from paganism to where they're sacrificing to these deities, these pagan gods, which they basically, made gods or put them in human or animalistic form. But it's really talking about something that has to do with a natural process that occurs that they put into a form to where they can better explain and understand. And that whole process of sacrifice to the gods came from paganism, and them giving that energy to the energy they want to basically be brought forth to help them with their natural life or natural situation, whether it be crops growing or healing of a illness or so on and so forth. So that's for the most part what we see a lot with paganism, and just them respecting the natural order of things, the cycle of life, death, reincarnation, so on and so forth. And everything like that. But easy to look up different pagans, and we're gonna get into some other stuff with pagans that a lot of people don't understand a little bit, but it's easy to look up that stuff and see what pagans worship back then or how they live their daily lives. The point we want to really put in this video is to really understand the truth and what was going on with paganism during the wars of the Diadochi, during the time that the Greeks conquered and the Romans conquered, because of course Rome was pagan. And then the question people don't ask themselves is, what happened? So a lot of people don't understand that back during that time, as I said, everybody was living this culture, and we know we had a pagan Rome. So where in history do we see this huge war between the pagans and the Romans? See, a lot of people see Constantine go ahead and turn from a pagan emperor to a Christian emperor, and everybody think that it was like, oh well, we're just gonna convert. But there's a lot more to it, a lot more stuff that happened that people don't understand with paganism, and how it came to basically disappear and start to come back out later on. Okay, so now here's where it gets a little bit weird, because you gotta understand the earliest mention that we have of Judaism is basically in 323 BCE. We're talking about right around the time Alexander the Great has died. Earliest mention we have of Judaism. And as I talked about repeatedly, how the Greeks came up with Judaism. So we know You have the Greeks conquer the Persians and Kemet. You have them basically create this religion, but we know that you have the whole wars of the Diadochi. You have them basically spreading Hellenization, which is basically what we know as Judaism, but it's not Judaism as we know of today, in the way it is today. Basically, like, our Old Testament in the King James Version, or even the Torah that the Jews use today. It's completely different. It wasn't even Judaism, if you really think about it. It was a religion that we will not know the name of, but we know that they basically would later write themselves into that position. So they would basically write themselves into history or put themselves into the Bible and say that during this time, this stuff was happening, as we know with the Old Testament and what the Israelites was basically doing. They would basically write themselves into history. And then now when you do the research, as I have done when I put out the videos, you see how the Old Testament corresponds with what the Greeks was doing around that time. And then you can kind of parallel everything and say, well, we know the Greeks is talking about themselves when they're talking about the Israelites. And those Africans, those people that was in Israel that was basically being converted, was being converted into what? And that is the thing, because it wasn't Judaism as we know of today. It wasn't talking about Abraham and Isaac. They wasn't teaching them none of that stuff. So we don't know exactly what they was converting them into. What we do know is when you go to Kemet, what do we find? The worship of Serapis. We find them basically trying to deify themselves. So it's going to make sense in a little bit, but it's weird. You got to look at this to understand what is exactly taking place. Now, we know a lot of people look at Rome, they look at Christianity, and they see the pagan symbolism everywhere. We know how Christmas corresponds with paganism, and every time we come up with, Saturnalia and all kinds of Roman or Christian holidays, Easter, so on and so forth, we see how it corresponds with something with, astrology, or something with solstice, something that's pagan. So what a lot of people don't understand is it's the same thing in the Old Testament. Same thing with Judaism. When you start paying attention, this is where they got it from. So now, as I always say, I make videos for a reason. I put them out in different orders to express things in, a way that's more easier to understand. So you got to understand that if you are living in the ancient world, plain and simple, if you're an ancient people, then you are basically pagan. Because that's what was going on around this time. So when we go back to the ancient times and you want to look at what people were doing, they're basically doing, practicing what the Christians would call paganism, plain and simple. So when you look at the Old Testament, what do we read repeatedly in the Old Testament? God is constantly telling the Israelites not to follow the gods of these other people. They keep traveling and, wandering up, bumping heads with these people who worship other gods. And it's replete throughout the Old Testament. Constantly keep running into these people who worship in Molech, worship in Baal. And they make a point to mention these names for a reason. So they constantly running into these people. So you have to look at the Hebrews, look at the Israelites and say, what? If they keep running into these people and not understanding the gods that these people are worshiping or what these people are doing, then these people, these Israelites, cannot be ancient people. They cannot be. Now, this is the reason why the Hebrews, the Israelites, have to be enslaved in ancient Egypt for, many years, so that you can explain why when they come out of bondage, they don't understand what's going on. Because before they went into bondage, they had to be pagan. They had to be following exactly what the rest of the people was doing, because everybody was doing this back then. There's no way around it. So when you start understanding why the Bible keep constantly mentioning Canaanites, Canaan, the Canaanites, so on and so forth, it's because this is where it was highly pagan. These Canaanite gods, all pagan gods. And the Bible is making sure that it talks about this because it knows when you start going back and looking in the ancient world, you're going to start finding these gods. And then you're going to say, oh, wow, the Bible was telling the truth about these people and what was going on. And this is what we need to stay away from. But this is what you need to research more and not run away from. So it's giving you these deities for a reason. And that whole story is basically trying to tell you the truth of what exactly is going on. So we know it's the Romans. We know it's the Greeks that's basically going out and they put themselves as the Hebrews in the Bible. and they're running out and they're conquering these people and constantly finding paganism, because a lot of them, believe it or not, was when they was traveling, when they was mingling in, they was mixing in with these people, and they was becoming pagan. Basically, what the Bible is telling you, what was happening to the Hebrews in the Old Testament, that they kept marrying in with these people and worshiping these other gods and so on and so forth. But when you understand the underlying thing that it's trying to tell you, because remember, they're gods, it's saying that you should worship yourself and not worship what these people are doing, or not get into what these people are doing and try to separate yourself from it. But it's a lot more to it than that. So they basically, when you look at the New Testament, we understand they took paganism, but they did it as well in the Old Testament. So they want you to believe that, the Israelites are special, different, God's chosen people. They come out of Egypt. Everybody else is just evil. The rest of the world corrupt, stupid, worshiping false gods. They don't know what the hell they're doing. These people been around for thousands of years, and whatever they're doing obviously must be working, because they've been doing it for thousands of years. And it's not like they coming out and they run into these people that don't have no type of no military or food, or they just super poor. These people have kingdoms, they have armies, they have structures, and so on and so forth. Obviously, whatever they're doing must be working. But they want you to believe that these Hebrews is just special, and what they doing is the right thing, and God allowed thousands of years to go by for these people to be worshiping the wrong God, the majority of the people on the planet, so that he could bring out his special people to usher in the worship of just him, while he basically used them to knock out the people who are doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is basically what the book is trying to tell you. So we keep seeing the Hebrew Israelites run into Baal worshipers. We talked about this in the Bible series, how they run into people worshiping Baal, and you got to understand this is all stolen from Canaanite gods. This is all Canaanite stuff that exists, and this is where they got it from. So you have Baal, which basically Baal, you have El Shaddai, you have Yahweh. All of these are all pagan gods, meaning basically the same thing. Baal means Lord. So a lot of times when you see them basically talking about Baal and Baal worship, they're talking about basically their own God. Going to make a lot more sense in a second. So basically, when you go back and start looking at the older biblical manuscripts, you're going to see where these names was there. Now, they hid that with the King James Version, but if you go and look at a lot of the Hebrew Torahs, a lot of the old Jewish books, they still have those names. El, God, his name is El. God name is El Shaddai. God name is Yahweh. All of these names are still there. These are Canaanite pagan gods, plain and simple, that they basically use it in the Old Testament, because they'll tell you that the God of the Old Testament is Yahweh. Then who's the God of the New Testament? Why does it seem like it's two different things going on, where we have God in the Old Testament, and then we basically have Jesus, doing everything and going through God? The stories is crazy. So this is where it came from. So you have, when you pay attention, the pagans, doing what they doing. Greeks come, take over. The Greeks establish their story, first. And we have this whole Old Testament with paganism until the Romans come in later. Same thing, paganism, but they install Jesus Christ, because remember what Rome is doing is trying to put man as a god, that image of man, which is, white man as God. So when we read about Baal worship, when we read about Molech and sacrifice to these gods, most of the time we look at the depictions, you always see the sacrifice of these children to these bull gods, something that we see in paganism all the time. And every time we talk about Baal, we the altars of Baal and so on and so forth. So Baal is, to the pagans, was a bull god. And it's the same thing we see in ancient times. You see so many different statues of the bull and how it was, deified. So now it says, and this is Numbers 23:22. And it says, God brought them out of Egypt. They are as strong as a wild ox. But if you go to the Jewish Bible, it says El brought them out of Mizraim, which we know is Egypt. He is for them like the strength of a wild ox or bull. They're trying to say ox. In other translations, you'll see the word bull. Now, you also have Baal, it says here, Lord, in the sense of owner or master of a wife or slave. So now when you go to Hosea 2:16, it says, and in that day declares the Lord, you will call me my husband, and no longer will you call me my Baal. I will betroth you to me forever. Now Exodus 6, it says down here, and God spoke to Moses and said unto him, I am Yahweh. And I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob as God Shaddai. Should say El Shaddai. But by my name Yahweh, I was not known to them. And I not only established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan. So it's esoterically, it's secretly trying to tell you basically what they did. That we basically stole the gods of the people from Canaan, and we basically gave them to us, our people, them. They stole them, gave them to themselves, and gave them to their descendants and so on and so forth, or their future ancestors, I should say. And we didn't basically tell them what we was going to do. They didn't know me by these names, so on and so forth. So when you look at it, it's telling you straight up what they did. They stole those pagan gods, and they telling you who they are in the Old Testament. So when we look at Baal worship, it's in and out. So you have the people worshiping Baal as a bad thing. And then you have them basically, when you understand esoterically, them telling you that Baal is God. So Yahweh, which is another name for El, another name for Baal, is all the same stuff. It's all pagan. So if God's name is Yahweh, then we're talking about the same God. So he said, they didn't know me as Yahweh. They know him as El Shaddai or El. And they doing this to cover their tracks, because they know when you go back and you start looking and doing the research, this is exactly what you're going to find. You're going to find the worship of these guys by these specific names. And it's going to be ancient. And they're going to make it like, well, we don't get Yahweh till later on. So we see Baal, we see El Shaddai, we see all this other worship. And this is their way of basically trying to say that they was worshiping these guys. Of course, yes, it's everywhere. And it's to basically explain what I said before. Before the captivity in Kemet, what was they doing? Who was they worshiping? So they could say, well, yeah, they was basically pagan. They was worshiping these guys by this other name. And then they didn't know my name is Yahweh. But it all means the same thing. It says here in Genesis 33, 19 through 20, I'll just read down here. The plot of land on which he had pitched his tent, there he erected an altar and called it Elohi, Israel. And it says down here in the footnote, because it's not the King James Version, it says, that is God, the God of Israel. Elohi, Israel. So understand El, as well as Baal, also was worship in the tent, just like we've seen with the tabernacle in the Old Testament, where God told them to build a whole tabernacle. It's basically like a big tent, and they go in there, and the Ark of the Covenant is in there, and it's where they go basically worship God. They got that from the Canaanites, and the worship of El, and the worship of Baal, the worship of Yahweh. So when you go and look, you have the oldest reference to the name Yahweh comes from Kemet, and the temple of Amenhotep III in Soleb. So they want us to believe that, the people walking around back then were stupid. It was so long ago, they didn't know nothing. They wasn't really doing anything special, anything like that. Nobody was writing anything. Everybody was illiterate. And we know they just found like a bunch of ancient writings pertaining to Africans and everything that they studied. They also found a long time ago the Amarna letters that basically proves that the Egyptians, even though it's more proof than this, but the Egyptians basically was ruling Israel, the land we call Israel back in the day. You also have writings from the pagans. You have writings from the so-called Canaanites. And they wrote about Baal. They wrote about Yahweh. They wrote about these deities, and it's in stone. They have it. They've had it for a long time. That's how they know. So we have these writings, and we have these ancient writings that predate anything biblical, speaking about the same thing the Old Testament is talking about. So you have Rome. You have the Greeks as well. The Greeks taking what they found during their conquest, what the people was worshiping, regurgitating it and plagiarizing it into a different form and giving it back to the people. That's basically leading, to a different form of worship when you understand. But we know Rome conquers the Greeks, and then Rome takes over and basically piggybacks off of what the Greeks are doing, because they're basically the same people when you really understand. And they continue Hellenization, and they go ahead and continue this whole new form of religion. And you got to really think about what was going on, because now you have Rome, which is pagan, and you have to understand why they say that, because it's one of the things they don't want to admit. And if you say, well, Rome is pagan, And okay, it's Christian, then who was these pagans, and what, what happened for them to convert? And then when you understand that pagan is old, and that we're talking about an ancient religion, it's going back to who? Who was the people that was basically starting it out? We know that the Europeans wasn't there the whole time. We know the Etruscans was there before, they took over. So we know that these people were pagan. They was all worshiping the same thing, which wasn't worship. It was just the way it was until the Europeans came and took it over. So again, this is going to be hard for people to fathom and get this, because again, you got to think about it. What are they converting these people into? We know they came, they conquered these people, they conquered these lands. These people are pagans. What are they converting them into? Where's the conversion? There is no Judaism. It don't exist. And that's the big trick there. So again, as I said before, we know, we got the proof. I showed you guys in the Cairo Museum in Kemet, where you have these statues of, you have Zeus Ammon, you have Serapis Christos, of course. You have all these deities that, image of white men, that they were trying to get the people to worship. And then you go and you look at Rome, and you see Rome basically doing the same thing. Once they took over, you have these Caesars, these men being worshipped as God, or as men being on the same par with God. Now that whole concept we know comes from ancient Kemet, where if you was Nisut, Pharaoh, then they would say that you were, the Ra, or you were Horus as well, or Cyrus, Ani, so on and so forth, that you had this part of this God aspect in you, because you are a ruler. And we see that with them basically trying to take themselves and put them in the aspect of God. And that's what they did. And that's what it was. And what we know today as Judaism is something that's later. Remember, nobody was speaking Hebrew. They wasn't speaking Hebrew. And when you go and look, everybody who studied it, when you go and look at the language that the Phoenicians and the Canaanites were speaking, it's closer to Hebrew than anything else. So we know when the Greeks conquered it, what they did when they went and started finding all this information with the Amarna letters and all the tablets they found with the Canaanites and the pagans, basically, talking about what they practiced. When they found these letters, they already understood the language. They already knew what was going on, and they took that language and mixed it in with their own language and created Hebrew and regurgitated what the pagans was doing, or the Canaanites was doing, into this religion that we have called Judaism. And paganism is a real ritualistic thing, and we see that with the Old Testament, and we see that with the New Testament as well. So you have the whole story with the pagans, right? Let's just pretend for a second that everybody is pagan. The Romans is pagan, and there's no Christianity yet. When you have Christianity come on the scene, because now Rome is pagan, and then you have Christians just start popping up out of nowhere. And then what we see is the many different stories of the persecution of the Christians in Rome. So many different stories about the bishops being tortured and Christians being hung and brutalized, and how the pagans just hated the Christians because they felt like their religion was stupid, and they did so many crazy things to them. Crucifixions was something that the pagans was doing, putting you on the cross the same way they did the lamb. And they felt like, well, your God is dumb, and if your God was supposed to be real, he would come and save you. And it's common sense, because the pagans, anything they do as far as any type of worship or offering to a god is to get something. It's for some kind of benefit. Like, we want crops to grow, we want to be healed, so on and so forth. So it's like, you're paying for what you're praying to your God for. What is your God doing for you? Let's see him come and save you. And it's funny how they put the same thing in the Old Testament. It's the same thing that they describe as the pagans doing to Christians, but they put it in the Old Testament, where you have the whole thing where Elisha and him basically egging on the people to come, tell your God to come, set this bull, this offering on fire, and we're going to see who God does it first, so on and so forth. This is what they say the pagans was doing to the Christians back then. But you have this whole thing, and you see this whole constant reference to Christians being tortured and brutalized, right? We got that out of the way. Now, how is it that, as I said before, if you have, understand, they had a whole system, these pagans. You had a bunch of pagan emperors and so on and so forth. But they had a whole system to where, they kept changing the rules, of course. So they had a system where you had to be basically identified by two people as being a Christian, And if you didn't complete a pagan ritual or prove that you were not Christian, they would basically kill you right there. And a lot of people was just like, giving up their lives because of the Christianity and so on and so forth. So we're talking about a pagan Rome that was diehard pagan, persecuting, killing Christians, so on and so forth. How in the world would that change? Now, on a bigger note, a more better point, what are they doing to the Jews? So if you have these pagans crucifying and killing and torturing Christians, what are they doing to the Jews? And when you read what the historians say and what's in the books, it says that, well, the pagans respected the Jews because they said that their religion was ancient. So they have respect for the Jews and let the Jews basically do what they want, which is why when we read the letters of Orestes and when we look back at when they're talking about the time of the Jews, how somehow the Jews are allowed to just go ahead and practice their religion. You have the Greeks going out and spreading Hellenization, but somehow they're leaving the Jews alone. The Jews are allowed to grow and do what they've been doing, but they're killing everybody else. But the Jews are just okay. We'll leave the Jews alone, let them do what they want to do, and we're just going to keep on killing these Christians who believe basically the same thing the Jews did, right? As far as the Old Testament. So you have that going on. It's like, okay, well, how could they allow, one to live and one to die? And then you had the whole beef between the Jews and the Christians, supposedly, the divinity of Jesus Christ. So then now you have in just 49 AD, this is Claudius. Let me just read down here. Claudius at first either expelled only Christians or restricted public assembly by Jews in general. Cassius Dio does not use the word Christian in his Roman history and appears not to distinguish or unable to distinguish Jews from Christians. Now you had Claudius in 49 AD supposed to have expelled Jews and Christians from Rome for basically arguing or, having some kind of skirmish over the divinity of Christ and so on and so forth. So they supposed to was expelled. The problem with that is we're talking about 45 AD. There is no Christianity. It don't exist. So even when they giving you the name, they didn't put a date in that little article. But even, we know Claudius was around during that time. It's 45 AD. There is no Christianity. Jesus died, less than 100 years ago. Or was crucified less than 100 years ago, supposedly. There is no Christianity. The first writing, the Gospel of Mark, he didn't write supposedly till, 70, 80 AD. Then you have Matthew not until 80, 85 AD. So we don't even have the writing of the Gospels that would give you the story of Christianity until later. So how was it Christianity during this time? And they would tell you that, oh, well, this is the reason why they put this in the books is they're trying to make it as if, well, Jesus was real, the disciples was real, and they're walking around and they're spreading this whole thing with Christianity and they're talking about, what happened, during this time, trying to make it as if it existed and that these bishops and everybody was around when clearly there's no proof to back that up. So now we also know that the earliest recorded mention of Christianity is by Ignatius in 100 AD in Antioch. And I believe Ignatius was a bishop. He basically was killed by the pagans, I believe. So you have that, and you got to pay attention again because it's almost like a magic trick. You have the pagans basically saying, okay, we're cool with the Jews. We're not going to mess with them. They're ancient. They're straight. We have all these accounts of them persecuting, butchering, massacring Christians all throughout Rome, killing them off, so on and so forth. And then all of a sudden, they just disappear. You have this whole rulership of the pagan Romans, and they go. It's just gone. Jews still around, Christians still around, pagans just all of a sudden, convert to Christianity. In the Old Testament, we read how many times the Jews went in and killed somebody that was worshiping false gods and doing, some minor stuff that got them basically killed and burned. And then you have Jesus come along in the New Testament, basically claim to be the Son of God, and the Jews does what? They take him to a pagan emperor. They take him to Pontius Pilate and say basically do something with this dude. Now we read Jesus basically keeping the people from stoning the woman taking adultery, Mary, I believe her name was. So we know, if you do something wrong, you do something crazy, they will stone you. We read in the Old Testament, as I said, kill, kill, kill. Jesus comes, says he's God. They take him to the pagan emperor, to a pagan in Rome to basically get dealt with. And the whole thing with the crucifixion, as I said, with Jesus is something that we see in Rome a lot. crucifixions was done all the time, and the fact that you have the crucifixion of Jesus and everything that involves paganism. Everything about Jesus is pagan. You know, you have his supposed birthday on Christmas, corresponding with the Corax festival, corresponding with the whole winter solstice. This is all paganism. It's all pagan. Plain and simple. Him being crucified on the cross is pagan. It's what they did. So everything about Jesus and what's happening to him at this point is pagan. And they're giving it to you. It's all paganism. So we got to look at that. So then, of course, we know they lied to us about everything. History is a lie. We know they lied about religion and so on and so forth. Why would we believe what they're telling us about ancient times and what the ancient Romans did? Of course, what they did can't be true if we know they're lying about what they say about us. So what they talking about and telling us about, you know, what the Romans was doing back in the day and how they was pagans and so on and so forth, why would we believe that? Because this is basically what they're teaching us in the schools. Why would we believe that and then, not believe everything else? It all has to be a lie. And it's a lie because it has to make sense and fit. We know before the Romans took over, you had the Etruscans that basically ruled Rome. These are black people that were there. They were pagan. When you go and look at the Etruscans and you just look it up, Etruscans paganism, they were pagan. All the stuff around there we see in Rome during that time was pagan. Pagan stuff with the Etruscan Empire and with the Etruscan people, we see it throughout, those lands. And basically what I'm trying to say here is when you look at them giving you this whole fake history of Rome persecuting Christians, the pagan Rome persecuting Christians and the pagan Rome kicking out Jews and Christians and so on and so forth, and the whole lie of the war, the Jewish war of 70 AD, is bogus. But people, they had to get Josephus to try to back it up, to try to give validity to it. There was no Jews fighting against the Romans in 70 AD. This whole thing that they're talking about with the whole persecution of the Christians by the pagan Romans and the whole persecution of the Jews by the Christians or the pagan Romans as well in 70 AD is basically the white people, the Europeans, kicking out the Etruscans. The whole Jewish war was the Etruscans versus the Romans and them trying to get their land back that was taken from them by the Romans, plain and simple. The whole persecution of the so-called Christians in Rome wasn't persecution of Christians, it was persecutions of pagans. And that's what it was. It was these people killing and persecuting the pagans. And the only reason why you have stories about it is because, of course, it was documented. When you see this whole, persecution and killing and murdering of these people, and we're talking about, black people. And this is why when you go back and look, when people see a lot of those ancient depictions of Christ and so on and so forth for Christians, they make them black. And they made that, back in the day to basically fool the people that's from that area who knew that these people was black and the people in that land was black. And it's to basically make people think, oh, well, it's some kind of conspiracy and Christ was black, so on and so forth. No, the people were. No such thing as a black or white Christ. It's just that simple. But this is what it was. It's basically them stealing what really happened. This is what they're good at. This is what they've been doing. They take the real history and make it fit them. There was no Christians being persecuted by pagans back in ancient Rome. It was the opposite. It was the people that was going to establish Christianity, persecuting and enslaving and killing the rightful people of that land, which was the black Etruscans in Rome. So then they want us to believe, of course, that with all the stuff they just told us, you have with the pagan Rome killing all these Christians, and you have the whole story of Constantine. A lot of people know the story. So you have Constantine, who basically, defeats Maxentius in the Battle of Milvian Bridge. And in this battle, what Constantine would later say is that Jesus came to him in a vision or in a dream and basically said that if you fly this symbol right here, basically put it on your flag and take this symbol with you out to battle, you will win. You will be victorious. And then you have, after this battle is over, which is essentially giving you the final fight between paganism and Christianity. Because now, with Constantine having his vision, he's now Christian. And he's going out to basically conquer and kill and defeat paganism with the last pagan emperor, Maxentius, who was basically the real person who's supposed to be in line to take the throne. So they meet up and on Milvian Bridge, and it's supposed to be this battle, and they try to make it like, it's this whole smart military strategy, and Constantine would win. And then you have Constantine basically walking around Rome, trying to, rebuild Rome, which if it was pagan before, I understand you got to get rid of some stuff. But the story goes, he is basically walking around, and he walks into Hagia Sophia. Hagia Sophia is basically supposed to be a Christian church. And he goes into Hagia Sophia, and he basically professes that he's now Christian. He tells the whole story that he didn't tell his men in battle, but he tells the whole story that Jesus was with him, and that's why he won, and he owed the victory of Rome to the Christian God. And supposedly after that, everybody basically just converts to Rome, and that's enough. So with everything, I mean, like if you read as much as I've read about the torture and persecution of Christians and how brutal they was and the stuff they did, they would have cooked that man. There's no way in the world he would have been able to walk into Hagia Sophia and claim he was Christian and not get killed right then and there by the people. Bullshit. If we all in there worshiping, and you walk in there and you say, you're Christian, and at this point, and they stress this part, it has never been done that a pagan ruler walked into the Christian church. Never been done. And don't make sense that that would happen if they keep killing them. So when you look at Hagia Sophia, first of all, it was never a Christian church. It was a pagan worship place. It was a pagan place where they went to sacrifice and offer. Because when you look around Hagia Sophia and other some of those other churches from around that town that they didn't want to knock down because they dope. Tourist money too. It's pagan symbols all over that place. Everywhere is paganism all over because it was pagan. Plain and simple. So the whole story of Constantine is a lie. And you have to be stupid to believe it based upon the fact that they was basically supposedly butchering and massacring Christians around this time. No way they would accept, Constantine as being not a pagan. So it's basically like I showed you guys in my video on Islam, where when you start tracing back a lot of those Islamic words, all they did was add an al or add a h or something like that to a name to basically convert it into Islam, or make it fit with the religion. And it's the same thing when you start going back to looking at the Old Testament, and they did the same stuff. They basically took paganism, a lot of the pagan symbolism's insane, and basically pushed it on over to Christianity and Judaism. And it's exactly what we see when you start looking at it. So in Joshua 19:27, it talks about Beth Dagon. And Dagon is a pagan god. It's the pagan fish god that you see a lot. And it's one of the things they point out with the Pope and the whole, supposedly they call it the mitre hat, to where it looks like, the fish. And we see with the Dagon, this is what they worship. And the Dagon god was basically a god of fertility. Now this fish god basically has so many different symbols, and it's basically what a Jesus fish represents, because it represents the cycle of rebirth, reincarnation, and so on and so forth. So the fish is basically, a pussy, or a vagina. That's what it's talking about. So this whole thing is the worship of that, and you understand now why Catholicism is focused more on Mary worship other than Jesus worship. It's just that simple. Catholicism is more Mary worship. It's more the woman. This is why they wear those hats. It's the cycle of birth and death, reincarnation, so on and so forth. And when you look around at so many different things, we see that symbolism with the fish symbolism in Starbucks and so on and so forth with this whole symbolism of Dagon. And Dagon is supposed to be, in some texts, he's the father of Baal. But it's not a coincidence that we see him in the Vatican, and that we see this fish symbolism in so many different places, because this is what it's talking about. A lot of stuff that we don't realize is pagan. A lot of stuff that we don't realize is Egyptian, and goes back to these ancient religions that we're going to be covering in this series.